I've always loved hiking and driving through the Rubicon Trail. It's my oasis away from the hustle and bustle of city life. But, during my last trip, I felt like I was being watched by something sinister. I could hear the rustling of the leaves and echoes over our jeeps as we drove through the empty forest. Suddenly, we noticed a strange figure sitting on a rock ahead of us. The figure appeared lifeless, like it was made of stone. A portal opened behind the man, and we felt a chill run down my spine. We couldn't believe what we saw. Slowly, we approached the man through what was known as the Old Man's Recluse Trail. But, the closer we got, the more apprehensive we became. His eyes seemed to pierce through us, and I felt like I was being scrutinized by a predator. He didn't move or say anything, just sitting there and staring at us, making me feel smaller and more frightened. As I stood there, feeling overwhelmed by fear, I began to sense that I was not alone. I had a sense that I had somehow crossed into a different world. The man's stare seemed to be drawing me in, giving me an inexplicable urge to touch the dark portal behind him. I tried to break away, feeling that something was terribly wrong, but the pull of the portal was too strong. The man suddenly sprang to life, and before I could react, he grabbed me and pulled me into the black void. The darkness surrounded me, and the sensation of being pulled from my body was so terrifying that I thought I might die. But then, it ended, and the darkness disappeared as quickly as it had come. I found myself in the same spot where I had started, with the man still seated on the rock. My heart was racing, and I wanted nothing more than to escape as quickly as possible. I turned and ran, feeling both enraged and terrified. For years after that day, I was plagued by nightmares. The image of the man on the rock and the dark portal behind him haunted me incessantly. It seemed as though the man was reaching out to me from beyond the grave, trying to drag me back into the darkness. But then, one day, I heard some disturbing news. The man on the rock had been a recluse, living in a haunted cabin deep in the woods. He had spent years performing strange rituals and invoking the dark spirits that lurked in the forest. He had become so obsessed with the occult that he had lost his mind, and he would lure hikers like me to their doom. I realized then that my fear had been justified. The man on the rock was a monster, and I was lucky to have escaped with my life. I could only hope that his wickedness had been swallowed by the same darkness he had tried to drag me into. The group of friends had planned their off-road adventure on the Rubicon Trail for months. They were excited to take on one of America's toughest off-road trails. They had spent several weekends upgrading their vehicles, preparing for the best and the worst scenarios. The group comprised 4 experienced drivers who knew the trail inside out. Nevertheless, they were aware of the challenges that lay ahead. The Rubicon Trail was notorious for being treacherous and unforgiving, with steep rock climbs, boulder-strewn paths, narrow passes, and mud bogs. The group was determined to tackle every obstacle on the trail, and nothing could weaken their resolve. They reached the steep incline with loose rocks and a sharp turn at the top. The first 2 vehicles made their way up the slope, and the third vehicle, a new Ford Bronco driven by a friend of the group, was on its way. As the Bronco began its ascent, something strange caught the group's attention. The Ford Bronco suddenly came to a halt on the slope, causing the group to worry. The engine seemed to be idling, but the vehicle wasn't moving. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out. It appeared to be the driver, but something was off. The group couldn't quite place what it was, but they could tell something was amiss. As the group watched, the driver closed the door, took out a small box from the back of the Bronco, and started walking up the slope. The friends exchanged puzzled glances but waited for a moment to see if the driver needed help. But to their surprise, the driver was making his way up the trail quickly and with ease, leaving them behind. The group decided to check on the Bronco, as they were confused about what was happening. However, when they approached the Bronco, they realized that something was wrong. The Bronco was empty, and the driver was nowhere to be found. They searched the immediate vicinity, but there was no sign of the driver anywhere. The friends started to feel uneasy as they were in the middle of nowhere and there was no sign of the driver or anyone else around. They decided to call for help and call the Rangers. The Rangers arrived quickly and searched the area, but the driver was nowhere to be found, not even any tracks or footprints had been left behind. The group was perplexed by what had happened. They'd seen the driver get out of the Bronco, and now there was no sign of him. They spent the day searching the area and asking other visitors if they had seen anything unusual. But no one had seen anything, and there were no clues as to what had happened. As the sun started to set, the group knew they had to make their way back. They left the Ford Bronco where it was and started their vehicles. However, as they were leaving, they saw something strange in the distance. On top of one of the rocky ridges, they saw someone standing, watching them. It was the same figure they had seen earlier by the Ford Bronco. The group was shocked and confused as they didn't know who the figure was or what they wanted. They called out, but the figure didn't respond. As they got closer, the figure turned and disappeared into the rocky terrain, and they lost sight of him immediately. As they made their way back, they couldn't shake off the eerie feeling they had experienced earlier. It was driving them crazy. Later that night, the group stopped at a campsite to rest and recuperate. As they sat around the campfire, they couldn't help but discuss the strange events of the day. One of the friends, who had been quiet all day, suddenly spoke up. They revealed that they had heard strange noises the night before, noises that sounded like they were coming from underneath their tent. They shrugged off the incident at the time but now wondered if there was more to it. Suddenly, the group heard another noise, a sound like someone was walking around their campsite. They looked around but saw nothing. It was too dark to see anything. Then, they heard it again, but this time, it was more apparent. The group got up and walked around the campground, but no one was there. The group went back to their campfire, and they were gripped with fear as they heard something moving closer to them. They turned around, and they saw what looked like a dark figure in the shadows. It was the same figure they had seen earlier on the Rubicon Trail, wearing what appeared to be a tattered leather jacket and boots. The group was frozen in fear as the figure slowly walked closer. Suddenly, the figure stopped, and it seemed to look directly at them. The group could see the outline of a skull-like face in the darkness, and its eyes glowed an eerie red. The figure started walking toward them again. The group got up and ran towards their vehicles, but as they looked back, they saw the figure disappearing into the woods. The group drove away from the campground, terrified, and unsure of what they had just experienced. They made it back to civilization eventually, but the event had left them scarred. They never talked about the incident again. They didn't know what they had encountered on the Rubicon Trail and if it was human at all. It was a warm summer night when some friends I decided to go camping in the Rubicon Trail with our Jeep Gladiators. We were all experienced off-road drivers and had gone camping many times before. We knew the Rubicon Trail was a tough terrain, but that was precisely what we were looking for. We packed all the necessary camping gear, food, and other essentials and started driving through the night to get to the perfect spot. The journey to the campsite was challenging and we had to navigate through rough terrain and steep hills. A section known as Old Sluice. After several hours of driving with some bumps and scratches from the narrow trail, we finally arrived at our selected destination at 2 a.m. The campsite was in the middle of a secluded part of the woods, far away from the urban areas, and we all found it peaceful. We quickly set up our tents and went to bed. As my wife was laying in our tent, we started hearing strange noises coming from the woods. At first we thought it was just the wind blowing through the trees or a bear searching for food. But as the noise persisted and it didn't sound like the wind, it sounded like someone crying in the distance. The rest of the group heard it too. We were all up now trying to figure out what it was and what should we do. We knew we were in the middle of the woods and anything could happen. Some of the group decided to investigate and trace the sound, however they couldn't see anyone or anything. We assumed it was just an animal and went back to our campsite. As the night wore on, the noises started to get louder and closer. The cries were getting more and more intense and sounded like they were coming from just a few feet away. It was starting to freak my wife and some of the other females in our group. Nevertheless, we tried to ignore the cries, but they were too loud. Suddenly we heard a rustling sound in the woods. It sounded like someone was moving through the brush. As we turned our heads, we saw a figure standing in the woods, waving at them. The figure was wearing a ripped-up old red dress that had a hood. She had long black hair. It was difficult to make out the face because it was too dark, but they felt like it was trying to tell us something. This person or thing creeped out some of us, and the way it moved was unnerving. The figure started walking towards us, but as it got closer, it suddenly vanished into the woods. It was like it was never there. We all got pretty scared at that point, so we quickly packed up camp and left immediately. The whole experience had left us feeling like we were being followed by an unseen force. While driving back, we saw a light in the woods and decided to stop to see if the figure had returned. What we saw was the same entity waving at us. The experience had rattled everyone to their bones.